Korah abuses Moses and the Torah. Then Korah went to the people to incite them to rebellion against Moses, and particularly against the tribute payments of the priests imposed upon the people by Moses. So the people might now form a proper conception of the oppressive burden of these tasks, Korah told them the following tale that he had invented. There lived in my vicinity a widow with 2 daughters, who owned for their only support a field whose yield was just sufficient to keep body and soul together. When the woman set out to plow her field, Moses appeared and said, "You shall not plow with an ox and an ass together." When she began to sow, Moses appeared and said, "You shall not sow with mixed seeds that are not all of the same kind." When the first fruit showed in the poor widow's field, Moses appeared and told her to bring it to the priests, for to them belonged the first of all fruit of the earth. And when at last the time came to cut it down, Moses appeared and ordered her not to harvest the corners of the field, and not to gather the leftovers of the harvest, but to give them to the poor. When she had done all that Moses had bidden her, and was about to thrash the grain, Moses appeared once more, and this time said, "Give me the heave offerings, the first and second tithes to the priests." When at last the poor woman understood that she could not possibly support herself, after the deduction of all the tributes that Moses had imposed on her, she sold the field, and with the proceeds purchased lambs, in the hope that she might now have the benefit of the wool, as well as the young of the sheep. She was, however, mistaken. When the first lamb was born, Aaron appeared and demanded it, for the firstborn belongs to the priest. She had a similar experience with the wool. At shearing time, Aaron reappeared and demanded the first of the fleece of the sheep, which, according to Moses' law, was his. But not content with this, he reappeared later and demanded 1 sheep out of every 10 as a tithe, to which again, according to the law, he had a claim. This, however, was too much for the long-suffering woman, and she slaughtered the sheep, supposing that she might now feel herself secure, in full possession of the meat. But not so. Aaron came again, and, basing his claim on the Torah, demanded the shoulder, the 2 cheeks, and the maw. "Alas," exclaimed the woman, "even the slaughtering of the sheep did not deliver me out of your hands. Let the meat then be consecrated to the sanctuary." Aaron said, "Everything devoted in Israel is mine. It shall be all mine." He then left, taking with him the meat of the sheep, and leaving behind the widow and her daughters weeping bitterly. "Such men," said Korah, concluding his tale, "are Moses and Aaron, who passed their cruel measures as divine laws." Pricked on by speeches such as these, Korah's horde appeared before Moses and Aaron, saying, "The burden you lay on us is heavier than that of the Egyptians, and moreover, since the incident of the spies, we are forced annually to offer as tribute the death of 15,000 men. It would have been much better for us had we stayed in Egypt." They also reproached Moses and Aaron with an unjustified love of power, saying, "On Sinai all Israel heard the words of God, 'I am your Lord.' How then do you lift yourselves up above the congregation of the Lord?" They knew no bounds in their attacks on Moses. They accused him of leading an immoral life, and even warned their wives to keep far from him. They did not, moreover, stop short at words, but tried to stone Moses. When at last he sought protection from God, calling for his assistance, he said, "I do not care if they insult me or Aaron, but I insist that the insult of the Torah be avenged. If these men die the common death of all men, I shall myself become a disbeliever, and declare the Torah was not given by God." Moses pleads in vain with Korah. Moses took Korah's transgression much to heart, for he thought to himself that perhaps, after the many sins of Israel, he might not succeed in obtaining God's pardon for them. He did not, therefore, have this matter decided immediately, but admonishing the people to wait until the following day, having a lingering hope that Korah's horde, given time for calm reflection, might themselves perceive their sin, to which an excess of drink might have carried them away. Hence he said to them, I may not now appear before the Lord, for although he partakes of neither food nor drink, still he will not judge such actions of ours, that we have committed after feasting and reveling. But tomorrow the Lord will show us who are his. Know now that just as God has set definite bounds in nature between night and day, between light and darkness, so also he has separated Israel from other nations, and so also he has separated Aaron from the rest of Israel. If you can obliterate the boundary between light and darkness, only then can you remove the boundary of separation between Israel and the rest, but not otherwise. Other nations have many religions, many priests, and worship in many temples, but we have one God, one Torah, one law, one altar, and one high priest, whereas you are 250 men, each of whom is imbued with the desire of becoming the high priest, as I too would like to be high priest, if such a thing were possible. But to prove Aaron's claim to his dignity, do this. Take censers, Korah and all your followers, and put fire in them, and put incense on them before the Lord tomorrow. The offering of incense is the most pleasant offering before the Lord. But for him who has not been called, this offering holds a deadly poison, for it consumed Nadab and Abihu. But I exhort you not to burden your souls with a deadly sin, for none but the man God will choose as high priest out of the number of you will remain alive. All others will pay with their lives at the offering of incense. These last words, however, far from restraining them, only strengthened Korah in his resolve to accomplish his undertaking, for he felt sure that God would choose him and none other. He had a prophetic thought that he was destined to be the forefather of prophets and temple singers, and for this reason thought he was specially favored by God. When Moses perceived that Korah was so determined, he directed the rest of his warning to the other Levites, the men of Korah's tribe, who, he feared, would join Korah in his rebellion. He admonished them to be satisfied with the honors God had granted them, and not to strive for priestly dignity. He concluded his speech with a last appeal to Korah to cause no separation in Israel, saying, Had Aaron arbitrarily assumed the priestly dignity, you would do right to withstand his presumption. But it was God, whose attributes are sublimity, strength, and sovereignty, who clothed Aaron with this dignity, so that those who are against Aaron are in reality against God. Korah made no answer to these words, thinking that the best course for him to follow would be to avoid picking an argument with so great a sage as Moses, feeling sure that in a public dispute he would be bested, and contrary to his own conviction, be forced to yield to Moses. Moses, seeing that it was useless to reason with Korah, sent a messenger to Dathan and Abiram, summoning them to appear before his court. He did this because the law required that the accused be summoned to appear before the judge, before judgment may be passed on them. And Moses did not wish these men to be punished without a hearing. Moses sent a messenger, and they answered the messenger, We will not come up. This shameless answer held an unconscious prophecy. They went not up, but, as their end showed, down, to hell. Not only did they refuse to comply with Moses' demand, they sent the following message in answer. Why do you set yourself up as master over us? What benefit did you bring us? You led us out of Egypt, a land like a garden of the Lord, but have not brought us to Canaan, instead leaving us in the wilderness where we are daily visited by the plague. Even in Egypt you tried to assume leadership, just as you do now. You beguiled the people in their exodus from Egypt, when you promised to lead them to a land of milk and honey. In their delusion they followed you and were disappointed. Now you attempt to persuade us as you persuaded them, but you shall not succeed, for we will not come and obey your summons. The shamelessness of these two men, who declined even to talk about their transgression with Moses, aroused his wrath to the uttermost. For a man does get a certain amount of satisfaction out of discussing the dispute with his opponents, whereas he feels badly if he cannot discuss the matter. In his anger he said to God, O Lord of the world, I well know that these sinners participated in the offerings of the congregation that were offered for all Israel. But as they have withdrawn themselves from the community, do not accept their share of the offering, nor let it be consumed by the heavenly fire. It was I who they treated so, I who took no money from the people for my labors, even when payment was due. It is customary for anyone who works for the sanctuary to receive pay for his work, but I traveled to Egypt on my own donkey and took none of theirs, although I undertook the journey in their interests. It is customary for those that have a dispute to go before a judge, but I did not wait for this and went straight to them to settle their disputes, never declaring the innocent guilty or the guilty innocent. When he perceived that his words had no effect on Korah and his horde, he concluded his words with a threat to the ringleaders. You and all your company are to be here tomorrow before the Lord, all of you, and Aaron. Korah spent the night before the judgment trying to win over the people to his side, and succeeded in doing so. He went to all the other tribes, saying to them, "Do not think that I am seeking a position of honor for myself. No, I want only that this honor fall to the lot of each in their rightful turn, whereas Moses is now king and his brother high priest." On the following morning, all the people, and not Korah's original company alone, appeared before the tabernacle and began to pick quarrels with Moses and Aaron. Moses now feared that God would destroy all the people, because they had joined Korah. Hence he said to God, "O Lord of the world, if a nation rebels against a king of flesh and blood because 10 or 20 men have cursed the king or his ambassadors, then he sends his army to massacre the inhabitants of the land, innocent as well as guilty, for he is not able with certainty to tell which among them honored the king and which cursed him. But you know the thought of man, and what his heart and kidneys counsel him to do. The workings of your creatures' minds lie open before you, so you know who had the spirit of each one. If one man sins, will you be angry with all the congregation?" God then said to Moses, "I have heard your prayer for the congregation. Say to them then, 'Get away from the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram.'" Moses did not immediately carry out these instructions, for he tried once again to warn Dathan and Abiram of the punishment impending on them. But they refused to give heed to Moses and remained within their tents. "Now," said Moses, "I have done all I could and can do nothing more." Hence, turning to the congregation, he said, "Depart, I pray you, from the tents of these wicked men, who even in their youth deserved death as a punishment for their actions. In Egypt they betrayed the secret of my slaying the Egyptian. At the Red Sea they angered God by their desire to return to Egypt. In Alush they broke the Sabbath, and now they troop together to rebel against God. They now well deserve excommunication and the destruction of all their property. Touch therefore nothing of theirs, lest you be consumed in all their sins." The community obeyed the words of Moses and drew back from the tents of Dathan and Abiram. They, not at all repentant, were not restrained from their wicked intention, but stood at the doors of their tents abusing and calumniating Moses. Moses then said to God, "If these men die on their beds like all men, after doctors have attended to them and acquaintances have visited them, then I shall publicly vow that the Lord has not sent me to do all these works, but that I have done them out of my own mind." God replied, "What would you have me do?" Moses, "If you have already provided the earth with a mouth to swallow them, it is well. If not, I pray you, do so now." God said, "As you decree a thing, it shall be done." Moses was not the only one to insist on punishment for the horde of Korah. The sun and moon appeared before God, saying, "If you give satisfaction to the son of Amram, we will set out on our course around the world, but not otherwise." God, however, hurled lightning after them, that they might go about their duties, saying to them, "You have never championed my cause, but now you stand up for a creature of flesh and blood." Since that time, the sun and moon have always had to be driven to duty, never doing it voluntarily, because they do not wish to look on the sins of man on earth. Korah and his crowd punished. God did not delay satisfaction of his faithful servant Moses. The mouth of hell approached the spot on which Dathan, Abiram, and their families stood, and the ground under their feet grew so shaky that they were not able to stand upright, but rolled to the opening and quickly went into the pit. Not only the people were swallowed by the earth, but also their possessions. Even their linen that was at the launderer's, or a pin belonging to them, rolled towards the mouth of the earth and vanished therein. Nowhere on earth remained a trace of them or of their possessions, and even their names disappeared from the documents on which they were written. They did not, however, meet an immediate death, but sank gradually into the earth, the opening of which adjusted itself to the girth of each individual. The lower extremities disappeared first, then the opening widened, and the abdomen followed, until in this way the entire body was swallowed. While they were sinking, slowly and painfully, they continued to cry, "Moses is truth, and his Torah is truth. We acknowledge that Moses is the rightful king and true prophet, that Aaron is the legitimate high priest, and that the Torah has been given by God. Now deliver us, O our Lord teacher Moses." These words were audible throughout the entire camp, so that all might be convinced of the wickedness of Korah's undertaking. Without regard to these followers of Korah, who were swallowed up by the earth, the 250 men who had offered incense with Aaron found their death in the heavenly fire that came down on their offering and consumed them. But he who met with the most terrible form of death was Korah. Consumed at the incense offering, he then rolled in the shape of a ball of fire to the opening of the earth and vanished. There was a reason for this double punishment for Korah. Had he received punishment by burning alone, then those who had been swallowed by the earth, and who had failed to see Korah smitten by the same punishment, would have complained about God's injustice, saying, "It was Korah who plunged us into destruction, yet he himself escaped it." Had he, on the other hand, been swallowed by the earth without meeting death by fire, then those who the fire had consumed would have complained about God's injustice that permitted the author of their destruction to go unpunished. Now, however, both those who were punished by fire and those who were swallowed up by the earth witnessed their leaders share their punishment. This terrible death did not, however, suffice to atone for the sins of Korah and his company, for their punishment continues in hell. They are tortured in hell, and at the end of 30 days hell again casts them up near to the surface of the earth, on the spot where they had been swallowed. Whosoever on that day puts his ear to the ground hears the cry, "Moses is truth, and his Torah is truth, but we are liars." Not until after the resurrection will their punishment cease, for even in spite of their grave sin, they were not given over to eternal damnation. For a time, Korah and his company believed that they should never know the relief from the tortures of hell, but Hannah's words encouraged them not to despair. In reference to them, she announced the prophecy, "The Lord brings low to hell and lifts up." At first they had no real faith in this prophecy, but when God destroyed the temple and sank its portals deep into the earth until it reached hell, Korah and his company clung to the portals, saying, "If these portals return again upward, then through them we shall also return upward." God then appointed them as keepers over these portals, over which they will have to stand guard until they return to the upper world. On and the 3 sons of Korah saved. God punished discord severely, for although the decree of heaven does not usually punish anyone below the age of 20 years, at Korah's rebellion the earth swallowed alive even children that were only a day old, men, women, and children, all together. Out of all the company of Korah and their families, only 4 people escaped ruin, to wit, On, the son of Peleth, and Korah's 3 sons. As it was Korah's wife who, through her inciting words, plunged her husband into destruction, so also to his wife On owes his salvation. Truly, to these two women applies the proverb, "Every wise woman builds her house, but the foolish pluck it down with their own hands." On, whose abilities had won him distinction far beyond that of his father, had originally joined Korah's rebellion. When he arrived home and spoke of it to his wife, she said to him, "What benefit shall it reap you? Either Moses remains master and you are his disciple, or Korah becomes master and you are his disciple." On saw the truth of this argument, but declared he felt it incumbent on himself to adhere to Korah, because he had given him his oath, which he could not now take back. His wife quieted him, however, entreating him to stay home. To be quite sure of him, however, she gave him wine to drink. Then he fell into a deep sleep of intoxication. His wife now carried out her work of salvation, saying to herself, "All the congregation are holy, and being such they will approach no woman whose hair is uncovered." She now showed herself at the door of the tent with streaming hair, and whenever one of the company of Korah, coming over to see On, saw the woman in this condition, he started back, and owing to this scheme, her husband had no part in the rebellion. When the earth opened to swallow Korah's company, the bed on which On still slept began to rock and roll towards the opening in the earth. On's wife, however, seized it, saying, "O Lord of the world, my husband made a solemn vow never again to take part in dissensions. You, that live and endure to all eternity, can punish him hereafter if he ever proves false to his vow." God heard her plea, and On was saved. She now requested On to go to Moses, but he refused, for he was ashamed to look Moses in the face after he had rebelled against him. His wife then went to Moses in On's place. Moses at first evaded her, for he wished to have nothing to do with women. But as she wept and lamented bitterly, she was admitted and told Moses all that had occurred. He now went with her to her house, at the entrance of which he cried, "On, the son of Peleth, step forth. God will forgive you your sins." It is with reference to this miraculous deliverance and to his life spent in doing penance that this former follower of Korah was called On, the penitent, son of Peleth, miracle. His true name was Nemuel, the son of Eliab, a brother of Dathan and Abiram. More marvelous still than that of On was the salvation of Korah's 3 sons, for when the earth yawned to swallow Korah and his company, these cried, "Help us, Moses!" The Shekinah then said, "If these men repent, they should be saved, for repentance I desire, and nothing else." Korah's 3 sons now simultaneously determined to repent their sin, but they could not open their mouths, for round about them burned the fire, and below them gaped hell. God was, however, satisfied with their good thought, and in the sight of all Israel, for their salvation, a pillar arose in hell, on which they seated themselves. There they sat and sang praises and songs to the Lord, sweeter than mortal ear had ever heard, so that Moses and all Israel listened to them eagerly. They were furthermore distinguished by God in receiving from him the prophetic gift, and they then announced in their songs events that were to occur in the future world. They said, "Fear not, the day on which the Lord will take out the ends of the earth, and the wicked shall be shaken out of it. For the pious will cling to the throne of glory, and will find protection under the wings of the Shekinah. Fear not, you pious men, the day of judgment, for the judgment of sinners will have as little power over you as it had over us when all the others perished and we were saved." Israel convinced of Aaron's priesthood. After the death of the 250 followers of Korah, who perished at the offering of the incense, Eleazar, the son of Aaron, was ordered to take up the censers out of the burning, in which the souls, not the bodies of the sinners, were burned. Then, out of these brazen plates, he made a covering for the altar. Eleazar, and not his father the high priest, received this commission, for God said, "The censer brought death on 2 of Aaron's sons, and therefore let the 3rd now fetch forth the censer and effect expiation for the sinners." The covering of the altar, fashioned out of the brass of these censers, was to be a memorial to the children of Israel, to the very end, and no stranger who is not of the seed of Aaron may come near to burn incense before the Lord. Such a one was not, however, to be punished like Korah and his company, but in the same way as Moses had once been punished by God, with leprosy. This punishment was visited on King Uzziah, who tried to burn incense in the temple, asserting that it was the king's task to perform the service before the king of all. The heavens hurried to the scene to consume him, just as a celestial fire had once done the 250 men who had wrongfully assumed the rights of priesthood. The earth wanted to swallow him, as it had once swallowed Korah in his company. But a celestial voice announced, "To no one except Korah and his company come punishments like this. This man's punishment shall be leprosy." Hence Uzziah became a leper. Peace was not, however, established with the destruction of Korah and his company, for on the very day that followed the terrible catastrophe, there arose a rebellion against Moses that was even more violent than the preceding one. For although the people were now convinced that nothing came to pass without the will of God, still they thought God was doing all this for Moses' sake. So they laid at his door God's violent anger against them, blaming not the wickedness of those who had been punished, but Moses, who, they said, had excited God's revenge. They accused Moses of having brought about the death of so many of the noblest among them as punishment for the people, only that they might not again venture to call him to account, and that he might hereby ensure his brother's possession of the priestly office, since no one would hereafter covet it, seeing that on its account the noblest among them had met so terrible a fate. The kinsmen of those who had perished stirred the flame of resentment, and spurred on the people to set a limit to Moses' love of power, insisting that the public welfare and the safety of Israel demanded such measures. These unseemly speeches and their unceasing, incorrigible perversiveness brought on them God's wrath to such a degree that he wanted to destroy them all, and told Moses and Aaron to go away from the congregation, that he might instantly set about their ruin. When Moses saw that there was wrath gone out from the Lord, and the plague had begun, he called Aaron, saying, "Take your censer and put fire in it from off the altar. Lay incense on it, and carry it quickly into the congregation, to make atonement for them." This remedy against death Moses had learned from the angel of death himself, at the time he was staying in heaven to receive the Torah. At that time he had received a gift from each one of the angels, and that of the angel of death had been the revelation of the secret that incense can hold death at bay. Moses, in applying this remedy, had in mind also the purpose of showing the people the injustice of their superstition concerning the offering of incense. They called it death-bearing, because it had brought death on Nadab and Abihu, as well as on the 250 followers of Korah. He now wished to convince them that it was this very incense that prevented the plague, and to teach them that it is sin that brings death. Aaron, however, did not know why he employed incense, and therefore said to Moses, "O my lord Moses, have you my death in mind? My sons were burned because they put strange fires into the censers. Shall I now fetch holy fire from the altar and carry it outside? Surely I shall meet death through this fire." Moses replied, "Go quickly and do as I have told you, for while you stand and talk, they die." Aaron hurried to carry out the command given him, saying, "Even if it be my death, I obey gladly, if I can serve Israel." The angel of death had meanwhile wrought terrible havoc among the people, like a reaper mowing down line after line of them, allowing not one of the line he touched to escape, whereas, on the other hand, not a single man died before he reached the front row. Aaron, censer in hand, now appeared and stood up between the ranks of the living and those of the dead, holding the angel of death at bay. The latter now addressed Aaron, saying, "Leave me to my work, for I have been sent to do it by God, whereas you would have me stop in the name of a creature that is only flesh and blood." Aaron did not, however, yield, but said, "Moses acts only as God commands him, and if you will not trust him, "Behold, God and Moses are both in the tabernacle. Let us go there." The angel of death refused to obey his call. Then Aaron seized him by force, and thrusting the censer under his face, dragged him to the tabernacle, and locked him in, so that death ceased. In this way Aaron paid off a debt to Moses. After the worship of the golden calf, that came to pass not without some guilt on Aaron's part, God had decreed that all 4 of Aaron's sons were to die. But Moses stood up between the living and the dead, and through his prayer succeeded in saving 2 out of the 4. In the same way Aaron now stood up between the living and the dead, to ward off from Israel the angel of death. God, in his kindness, now wanted the people once and for all to be convinced of the truth that Aaron was the elect, and his house the house of priesthood. Hence he told Moses to convince them in the following fashion. On God's command, he took a beam of wood, divided it into 12 rods, and told every prince of a tribe to write his name on one of the rods, and laid up the rods overnight before the sanctuary. Then the miracle came to pass, that the rod of Aaron, the prince of the tribe of Levi, bore the ineffable name, which caused the rod to bloom blossoms overnight and to yield ripe almonds. When the people, who had all night been pondering which tribe should be proven by the rod of its prince to be the chosen one, went early in the morning to the sanctuary and saw the blossoms and almonds on the rod of Aaron, they were at last convinced that God had destined the priesthood for his house. The almonds, which ripened more quickly than any other fruit, at the same time informed them that God would quickly bring punishment on those who would venture to usurp the powers of priesthood. Aaron's rod was then laid up before the holy ark by Moses. It was this rod kings used until the time of the destruction of the temple, when, in miraculous fashion, it disappeared. Elijah will in the future fetch it forth and hand it over to the Messiah. Next, the waters of Meribah. End part 63 of 95, TheLegendsOfTheJews.com.